My name is Cameron Miller, and this is the fifth Sunday in the Easter season cycle. Now, there were quite a few years when I would climb into the pulpit on Christmas Eve and get into the slimy, smelly, intimate details of childbirth, and as a way to access the Christmas story, you know. It was a great way to make that story more real. But it wasn't without objection from some in the pews who didn't dress up and come to a beautiful candlelight ceremony with all the music and trimmings to hear about how it really was. So I've been thinking back on that this week and wondering how they would feel about the Ethiopian eunuch. I mean, we could get real about him. I don't remember the last time that we read this story here, because I often prefer to have both the Hebrew text and the gospel text along with a secular or poetic reading, a poem. That means eliminating the New Testament reading in the common lectionary. But the common lectionary generally eliminates the Hebrew text for Easter season and includes a second New Testament reading. So anyway, all of that aside, I'm sure we have visited this story at least once in the last, 3, 6, 9 years of the 3-year cycle of the common lectionary. But anyway, it's worthy of another reading, and this time with a pinch of embellishment. So here goes. Once upon a time, a handsome and regal man was parked in his chariot with both feet propped up on the lip of the wagon and reading a parchment in Greek. Though not his first language, this man was educated beyond all but a very few in his day. And it was a gorgeous day, and the road he was on ran parallel along a high, grassy bluff overlooking the sapphire blue of the Mediterranean Sea. The stiff, salt air soothed his hot skin, and it jingled the gold-like chimes hanging in abundance from his ears and his head and his neck and his arms. His whole caravan was 45 camels deep, and he had stopped it all simply because he wanted to read in peace. The wagons, the chariots, the camels sprawled out across the road, a confetti of people and animals randomly intermingling and issuing a cacophony of noises. But there he sat, the first lieutenant to the Candace, a queen so famous and esteemed she was called by her generic title, the Candace. There he was, black skin gleaming in the heat with the Judean hills and wearing the scent and the textures of wealth and power. There he was, testicles surgically removed and publicly proclaimed, granting him access to wealth and privilege, but at a very dear price. In his strength and power, and in his intelligence and beauty, he bore an isolated loneliness known by him and those of his caste, the ones who slept alone. He, the eunuch, was treasurer to the queen and keeper of millions. He, the eunuch, seemed exotic even to the Romans who ruled his homeland as the farthest fingertips of their empire. The word Ethiopian itself was translated by its conquerors as the place where the sun sets. Now, the Romans, of course, believed that their city, Rome, was the very place where the sun rose. And so Ethiopia was where it landed mysteriously at the end of the day. He, the eunuch, was exotic, and he, the eunuch, created a stir wherever he went in those northern kingdoms. In his quiet loneliness, in his secret pain, he had just been visited. He had just been touched as never before by the presence of someone or something that knew him deep inside. Reading a strange poem and reading it in his second language, a poem about a people of yet a third language, he suddenly felt the stirrings of a visitor within himself. He read these words in the poem, and he read them over and over and over again. He read, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised and he was esteemed not." Even then, as the eunuch read it, it was a 500-year-old poem. It was from a set of 4 poems by the Hebrew prophet Isaiah. The eunuch knew what Isaiah was describing. He knew what the poet knew. Who was this poet who wrote about? The eunuch wanted to know. The poem went on, and the eunuch could not stop reading. He read, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." Yes, the eunuch shouted inside. He had lived the same strange servanthood of violence. Who is this man? The eunuch was desperate to find out. He, the eunuch, so much wanted to know who he was reading about. And so he stopped the whole caravan just to read more about this strange, suffering servant. And then, suddenly out of nowhere, the little man appeared. The little man stepped out of nowhere to address the big man. The little man, with 4 daughters, who had escaped from Jerusalem to avoid being killed like his friend Stephen, stepped out of nowhere and took the risk to touch the big man. The eunuch did not know it, but in approaching him, Philip was crossing a chasm so deep and so dark that he feared to imagine where the bottom was for those who fell in. You see, Philip's people were taught from a very young age to never, ever, never talk to or touch someone who was not one of their own. To do so would make Philip and any of his people dirty, physically and spiritually unclean. To touch someone outside of his own people would degrade him before God, and a eunuch, Philip was taught, no matter what his profession or his ethnicity, no matter what his power or status, was spiritually corrupt and unclean. No one who had lost his testicles, no matter how it happened, could stand before God. That's what Philip's people had been taught. And anyone who had dealings with a eunuch would endanger his or her own ability to stand before God as one of the righteous. Philip knew all this. And had the eunuch known it too, he would surely have felt all the more isolated, all the more lonely, all the more angry. Who is this man? The eunuch implored Philip, recognizing Philip's dress and ethnicity as being one of those from whom the poem had come. Philip told the eunuch as much of the story as he knew, shared his own painful servanthood too, took his brokenness and touched it to the eunuch's brokenness. And in that brief encounter, they both felt a healing power move between them. And then the eunuch asked to be baptized. And Philip got deep in the water with him, their skin and sweat and their hope mingling against all standards of right and wrong. And then the big man with no testicles and the little man with 4 daughters, they both went their own ways. As abruptly as it began, they left each other to return to their own people, to their own destinies, and never to meet again, and yet forever changed. How great a story is that? That's a story about us. It's about us. You don't have to be a eunuch to understand your place in this story. It's about the loneliness and the sense of isolation that all of us carry inside. It's a story about all the times that we were not trusted to be ourselves, to bring our whole selves to a task, and instead we're commanded or shamed into a narrow role and definition given by others. That story is about how fearful we are to share with someone else our own story, or to share our inklings about the presence of God that gilds our own story like slivers of light through the curtain. Yeah. The Ethiopian eunuch, the one inside you and me, just sits there if left to him or herself. That lonely, suffering servant with so much strength and potential sits in perpetual silence and is left to be diminished when we do not connect him or her with the Philips who are around us. Now, the real truth is that childbirth is messy and painful and hazardous. And it is also true that the healing of our woundedness requires the scary, painful, and inelegant sharing of those parts of ourselves we keep in solitary confinement because we fear we won't be loved. You don't need me to tell you about your eunuch. We all have one. She or he needs to connect with someone, to be baptized in the love of others, and be set free.